Rain pounded the dark, empty streets as Amanda stared up at the towering mansion, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. This was it, the moment of truth. After months of carefully planning, she was finally ready to confront the corrupt homeowners association that had terrorized her neighborhood for far too long. A flash of lightning illuminated the ominous iron gates guarding the palatial estate. Amanda took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation to come. She knew the odds were stacked against her, but failure was not an option. This was her one chance to take back control and expose the HOA's web of lies and deceit. Gripping a manila envelope tightly, Amanda pushed open the car door and stepped out into the relentless downpour. The cold rain stung her face, but she refused to let it deter her. With unwavering determination, she approached the gates and pressed the intercom button, her heart pounding in her ears. "Who is it?" A gruff voice crackled through the speaker. "Amanda Sinclair," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm here to see Mrs. Wilkins. It's urgent." There was a brief pause, and then the gates creaked open, revealing a long, winding driveway leading up to the imposing mansion. Amanda took a deep breath and stepped through, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As she approached the front door, it swung open, and a tall, slender woman in an expensive designer dress greeted her with a saccharine smile. "Amanda." Mrs. Wilkins purred, her cold eyes glittering. "What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Amanda felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to back down. "You know exactly why I'm here, Mrs. Wilkins," she said, her voice laced with barely concealed anger. "I have evidence of your corruption, and I'm not leaving until you answer for your crimes." Mrs. Wilkins' smile never wavered, but her eyes narrowed. "My dear, I have no idea what you're talking about. The Homeowners Association exists to maintain the integrity and property values of our neighborhood. Surely you can't object to that." "Don't play dumb with me," Amanda snapped, thrusting the manila envelope towards her. "I have proof of your illegal kickbacks, fraudulent contracts, and the way you've been exploiting the residents for your own personal gain." Mrs. Wilkins arched a perfectly plucked eyebrow, her expression unperturbed. My, you've been a busy little investigator, haven't you?" She chuckled, the sound sending a shiver down Amanda's spine. "Unfortunately, your little evidence means nothing. The HOA has powerful connections, and the law is on our side." Amanda felt her heart sink as the realization dawned on her. She had underestimated the extent of the HOA's influence, and now she was facing an uphill battle that seemed increasingly hopeless. "You can't just get away with this," she said, her voice trembling with desperation. "The residents deserve to know the truth." Mrs. Wilkins's smile widened, and she stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity. "Oh, my dear Amanda, the residents already know the truth. They know that the HOA is the only thing standing between them and the chaos that would ensue without our guidance." She leaned in, her breath tickling Amanda's ear. "And they know that if they ever dare to defy us, there will be consequences. Severe consequences." Amanda's blood ran cold as the full weight of Mrs. Wilkins's words sank in. She had walked right into a trap, and now she was at the mercy of a formidable adversary who seemed to hold all the cards. As the rain continued to pelt the mansion, Amanda realized that this was no longer just a fight for justice. It was a battle for her very survival. The air was thick with tension as Amanda stood in the foyer of the Wilkins mansion, rain dripping from her coat. Mrs. Wilkins' chilling words echoed in her mind, and she knew she had underestimated the power of the corrupt HOA. "You have no idea what you're up against, do you, my dear?" Mrs. Wilkins purred, her manicured fingers tapping against the ornate marble table beside her. Amanda clenched her jaw, refusing to show any sign of fear. "I know exactly what I'm up against. A greedy, power-hungry organization that's exploiting the residents for your own gain." Mrs. Wilkins let out a soft, patronizing laugh. "Oh, Amanda, you have such a simplistic view of things. The HOA is far more than just a greedy organization. We are the backbone of this community, the guardians of order and stability. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. And anyone who dares to challenge that order will be swiftly and decisively dealt with. Amanda felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to back down. I have evidence of your corruption, Mrs. Wilkins. I'm not going to just sit back and let you continue to abuse your power. Evidence? Mrs. Wilkins scoffed. My dear, do you really think a few pieces of paper will be enough to take down the HOA? She shook her head, a smug smile on her face. You have no idea the kind of resources we have at our disposal. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the full extent of the HOA's influence. They were a juggernaut, a well-oiled machine that seemed impervious to any challenge. Then why don't you tell me? She said, her voice trembling slightly. What exactly are you capable of? Mrs. Wilkins' smile widened, and she gestured towards the door. Why don't you step outside and see for yourself? Filled with a mixture of trepidation and determination, Amanda followed Mrs. Wilkins out into the rain-soaked darkness. As they stepped onto the front porch, Amanda's eyes widened in horror at the sight that greeted her. The once quiet street was now teeming with activity. Uniformed security guards patrolled the sidewalks, their movements precise and coordinated. Sleek black SUVs were parked at strategic intervals, their occupants watching the proceedings with a keen, predatory gaze. As you can see, we have eyes and ears everywhere, Mrs. Wilkins said, her voice dripping with condescension. The HOA is the law here, Amanda, and we will not hesitate to use any means necessary to protect our interests. Amanda felt her stomach twist with dread. She had walked right into a trap, and now she was surrounded by the HOA's formidable forces. The odds of her succeeding in her mission seemed impossibly slim. You can't just intimidate me with your goons and your fancy toys, she said, mustering up as much bravery as she could. I'm not going to back down, no matter what you do. Mrs. Wilkins chuckled, shaking her head. Oh, Amanda, you really are a stubborn one, aren't you? But trust me, you have no idea what you're up against. She turned and headed back into the mansion, pausing at the doorway. I'll give you one last chance to reconsider your little crusade. Walk away now, and I promise we'll leave you alone. But if you persist, she shrugged, a sinister smile spreading across her face. Well, let's just say the consequences won't be pretty. With that, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving Amanda alone on the porch, the rain pounding around her. She stood there, her heart racing, as she surveyed the scene before her. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was absolute, and she knew that if she continued to fight, she was risking more than just her own safety. But the thought of letting the corrupt organization continue to terrorize the residents was unacceptable. She had come too far to back down now. Gritting her teeth, Amanda turned and headed back to her car, her mind racing with a new plan of attack. She might be outnumbered and outmatched, but she was determined to find a way to take down the HOA, no matter the cost. The rain had let up, but the air hung heavy with tension as Amanda sat in her car, her fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. The encounter with Mrs. Wilkins had shaken her, but she refused to let fear paralyze her. Pulling out the manila envelope, she rifled through the documents, her eyes scanning the pages with renewed determination. There had to be a way to use the HOA's own power against them. As she pored over the evidence, a plan began to form in her mind. It was risky, and the odds were stacked against her, but if she could pull it off, it might just be enough to bring the corrupt organization to its knees. Steeling herself, Amanda stepped out of the car and made her way back to the Wilkins mansion. The security guards eyed her warily, but she ignored them, striding purposefully towards the front door. This time, it was a different woman who greeted her, a stern-faced woman in a crisp suit. Mrs. Wilkins is not available, she said, her voice clipped. If you have any business with the HOA, you'll need to schedule an appointment. Amanda held up a hand, her expression unwavering. "I'm not here to see Mrs. Wilkins. I need to speak with the HOA board." The woman's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but she quickly regained her composure. "The HOA board does not meet with individual residents," she said, her tone dismissive. "This is a matter of urgent public interest," Amanda countered, her voice calm and resolute. "I have information that could expose the HOA's corruption and illegal activities." The woman's eyes narrowed, and Amanda could see the wheels turning in her mind. Finally, she let out a resigned sigh. "Wait here," she said, turning and disappearing back into the mansion. Amanda waited, her heart pounding in her chest. If this gambit failed, she wasn't sure what she would do next. But she had to try, for the sake of her neighborhood and the residents who were being exploited by the HOA's corrupt practices. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open again, and the woman reappeared, followed by a group of well-dressed individuals. Amanda recognized them as the members of the HOA board, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed irritation. "This had better be important," one of the men snapped, his arms folded across his chest. Amanda took a deep breath, then stepped forward, her chin held high. "I have evidence of widespread corruption and illegal activities within the Homeowners Association," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm here to demand a full investigation and immediate action to address these issues." The board members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from annoyance to something resembling amusement. "And what, exactly, do you think you're going to do about it?" another board member asked, a condescending smirk on his face. Amanda steeled herself, knowing that this was the moment of truth. "I'm going to take this evidence to the media," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm going to make sure that every resident in this neighborhood knows the truth about the HOA's corrupt practices." The board members erupted into laughter, their mocking jeers echoing through the foyer. "Do you really think the media is going to listen to some disgruntled homeowner?" One of them sneered. "The HOA has a well-oiled public relations machine, and we have plenty of influence in the local news outlets." Amanda felt her stomach twist with dread, but she refused to back down. "Then I'll take it to the authorities," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll make sure that the corruption and illegal activities of the HOA are thoroughly investigated and exposed." The laughter died down, and the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Amanda could see the fear and uncertainty in their eyes, and she knew she had struck a nerve. "You're making a grave mistake, Miss Sinclair," one of the board members said, his voice low and threatening. "The HOA has many powerful allies, and we will not hesitate to use every resource at our disposal to silence you." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to be intimidated. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice filled with defiance. "And I'm not going to stop until the truth comes to light." The board members exchanged one last, long look, then turned and disappeared back into the mansion, leaving Amanda alone on the porch, her resolve hardening with every passing moment. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy and oppressive as Amanda made her way back to her car. The confrontation with the HOA board had left her shaken, but also more determined than ever to expose their corruption. As she slid behind the wheel, her gaze drifted to the manila envelope on the passenger seat, the incriminating documents inside a testament to the HOA's deceitful practices. She knew that if she went public with this information, she would be risking everything: her safety, her livelihood, even her very life. But the thought of the innocent residents being exploited and terrorized by the HOA's ruthless tactics was too much to bear. She had to do something, even if it meant putting herself in the line of fire. Steeling her resolve, Amanda started the car and pulled out of the Wilkins driveway, her mind racing with a new plan of attack. She couldn't go to the media or the authorities directly. The HOA had too many powerful connections, and they would undoubtedly find a way to bury the story or discredit her. No, she needed to find a way to outsmart them, to use their own arrogance and overconfidence against them. and she had just the idea. As she navigated the rain-slicked streets, Amanda's lips curled into a determined smile. The HOA might think they had her cornered, but she was about to play her trump card, a secret that would turn the entire power dynamic on its head. Reaching her apartment, Amanda quickly changed out of her wet clothes and grabbed her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed a series of secure financial records and property deeds. The information she was about to uncover would be the key to taking down the HOA once and for all. With a deep breath, Amanda pressed send on the email she had composed, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was a high-stakes gamble, but if it paid off, the consequences for the HOA would be catastrophic. The next day, as the sun peeped through the clouds, Amanda made her way back to the Wilkins mansion, a confident swagger in her step. This time, the security guards eyed her warily, as if sensing the shift in the balance of power. When the door opened, it was Mrs. Wilkins herself who greeted her, her usually impeccable composure betrayed by a hint of unease. "Amanda," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "to what do I owe the pleasure of your company again?" Amanda didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Wilkins," she said, her voice cool and collected. "One that I think you'll find very interesting." Mrs. Wilkins' eyebrows arched in curiosity, and she gestured for Amanda to come inside. As they stepped into the foyer, Amanda could see the board members gathered, their expressions a mix of confusion and apprehension. "So, what is this proposition of yours?" Mrs. Wilkins asked, her gaze piercing. Amanda took a deep breath, then produced a stack of documents from her bag. "These are the deeds and financial records for every property in this neighborhood," she said, her voice steady, "including this very mansion." The board members exchanged puzzled glances, and Mrs. Wilkins' brow furrowed in consternation. "I'm afraid I don't understand," she said, her tone laced with a hint of concern. Amanda's lips curled into a triumphant smile. "It's quite simple, really. I own this entire neighborhood, Mrs. Wilkins. Every single property, including this mansion." The stunned silence that followed was deafening, and Amanda could see the panic and disbelief in the faces of the HOA board members. Mrs. Wilkins, for once, seemed to be at a loss for words. "But how?" she stammered, her composure slipping. Amanda leaned in, her eyes gleaming with a fierce determination. "I've been playing your game, Mrs. Wilkins, and now the tables have turned." The realization dawned on the HOA board, and Amanda knew that the power had shifted firmly into her hands. The air in the Wilkins mansion was thick with tension as Amanda stood, her triumphant gaze fixed on the stunned faces of the HOA board members. Mrs. Wilkins, her usual composure shaken, stared at the stack of documents in Amanda's hands, her mind racing to process the implications. "This can't be possible," she finally breathed, her voice laced with a hint of panic. "How could you have acquired ownership of the entire neighborhood?" Amanda's lips curled into a wry smile. "It's amazing what you can discover when you start digging into the HOA's financial records," she said, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "It turns out that your little organization has been siphoning off funds and engaging in all sorts of shady real estate dealings." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "And you know what they say, the more dirt you uncover, the more you find." Mrs. Wilkins' eyes narrowed, and Amanda could see the gears turning in her mind as she tried to formulate a response. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions a mix of disbelief and trepidation. "So, what exactly are you proposing, Miss Sinclair?" Mrs. Wilkins finally asked, her voice carefully measured. Amanda leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "It's simple, really. You and your corrupt little organization are going to step down, and I'm going to take over the management of this neighborhood." The board members erupted into a chorus of protests, but Amanda held up a hand, silencing them. "I have the proof, and I'm not afraid to go public with it," she said, her voice calm and resolute. The residents deserve to know the truth about the HOA's misdeeds, and I'm not going to let you continue to exploit them. Mrs. Wilkins' eyes narrowed, and Amanda could see the gears turning in her mind. Finally, she let out a soft, mirthless chuckle. "You really think you can just waltz in here and take over, don't you?" she said, her voice laced with a dangerous edge. "You have no idea the kind of power and influence the HOA wields. We won't go down without a fight." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to be cowed. "I'm well aware of the risks, Mrs. Wilkins, but I'm also not naive enough to think that I can take you on alone." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "That's why I've brought in some reinforcements." As if on cue, the front doors swung open, and a group of well-dressed individuals entered the foyer, their expressions stern and determined. Amanda recognized them as prominent members of the community, business leaders, respected professionals, and even a few local politicians. "What is the meaning of this?" Mrs. Wilkins demanded, her voice rising in pitch. One of the newcomers, a tall, imposing man with a graying beard, stepped forward. "Mrs. Wilkins, the residents of this community have had enough of your corrupt and abusive practices," he said, his voice firm and unyielding. "We've been working with Ms. Sinclair to gather the necessary evidence, and we're here to ensure that the HOA is dismantled and its assets are returned to the rightful owners." The board members erupted into a frenzy of protests, but the newcomers stood their ground, their expressions unwavering. Amanda watched with a sense of triumph as the power dynamic shifted, the HOA's iron grip on the neighborhood crumbling before her eyes. Mrs. Wilkins, her face a mask of barely concealed rage, turned to Amanda, her eyes narrowed to slits. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. "But this is far from over. The HOA has resources and allies that you can't even begin to imagine." Amanda's smile widened, and she leaned in, her gaze unwavering. "Oh, I'm well aware of that, Mrs. Wilkins. But I'm not playing by your rules anymore. This is my neighborhood now, and I'm going to make sure that the residents are protected from your corruption, no matter what it takes." The tension in the room was palpable, and Amanda knew that the battle had only just begun. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. Hope that the residents of this community could finally reclaim their lives and their homes from the tyrannical grip of the HOA. The air in the Wilkins mansion was thick with hostility as Amanda and the group of community leaders faced off against the cornered HOA board. Mrs. Wilkins' eyes were alight with a desperate fury, her composure crumbling as she realized the extent of her organization's downfall. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "But the HOA has resources and allies that you can't even begin to imagine. This isn't over, not by a long shot." Amanda met her gaze unflinchingly, her expression calm and resolute. "I'm well aware of the challenges ahead, Mrs. Wilkins, but I'm not playing by your rules anymore. This neighborhood belongs to the people now, and we're going to make sure that it's run in a way that actually benefits the residents, not your corrupt organization." The community leader who had spoken earlier, a man named Richard Thompson, stepped forward, his imposing frame radiating authority. "Mrs. Wilkins, the jig is up. We have irrefutable evidence of your illegal activities, and we're prepared to take this to the authorities if necessary. The residents of this community deserve better, and we're going to make sure they get it." The HOA board members exchanged panicked glances, their bravado quickly crumbling in the face of the formidable alliance that had gathered against them. Mrs. Wilkins, however, remained defiant, her eyes narrowing to slits. "You have no idea what you're up against," she hissed. "The HOA has friends in high places, people with the power to make your lives a living hell. If you think you can just waltz in here and take everything away from us, you're sorely mistaken." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to back down. "We're prepared to face whatever challenges come our way, Mrs. Wilkins, and we have the full support of the community behind us." She turned to the community leaders, her gaze unwavering. Isn't that right? The group murmured their assent, their expressions resolute. Mrs. Wilkins' face twisted into a snarl, and she opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the sound of a commotion outside drew their attention. The front door burst open, and a group of armed security guards rushed in, their weapons drawn. Amanda felt her heart skip a beat as she realized that the HOA had called in its own reinforcements. Everyone, hands in the air. One of the guards barked, his voice gruff and commanding. The community leaders immediately complied, but Amanda refused to be cowed. She stepped forward, her chin held high. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice betraying a hint of fear. The lead guard, a burly man with a scar across his face, sneered. "By order of the Homeowners Association, you are all under arrest for trespassing and conspiracy." Mrs. Wilkins' lips curled into a triumphant smile, and she stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with malice. "I told you, Ms. Sinclair, that you had no idea what you were up against. The HOA has the power to make your life a living hell, and we're just getting started." Amanda felt her stomach twist with dread, but she refused to show her fear. "You can't do this," she protested, her voice trembling slightly. "We have evidence of your illegal activities, and the community is behind us." Mrs. Wilkins chuckled, her expression cold and calculating. "Oh, I'm sure the authorities will be very interested in hearing your side of the story. But in the meantime, you and your little friends are going to be spending some quality time in our special holding facility." The guards moved in, their weapons trained on the group. Amanda felt a surge of panic, but she knew that she couldn't give in to the HOA's intimidation tactics. She had to find a way to turn the tables once again, even if it meant putting everything on a line. As she was led away, her mind raced with a desperate plan. She couldn't let the HOA win, not after she had come so far. The stakes were too high, and the future of the entire community hung in the balance. The dim, oppressive atmosphere of the HOA's special holding facility did little to dampen Amanda's resolve as she sat, hands cuffed, facing a trio of stern-faced security guards. Despite the precariousness of her situation, she refused to let fear consume her. This was just another obstacle to overcome in her relentless quest to dismantle the corrupt Homeowners Association. As the guards eyed her warily, Amanda took a deep breath and spoke up, her voice steady and unwavering. "I know you're just following orders, but what you're doing is wrong. The HOA is a corrupt and abusive organization, and the residents of this community deserve better." One of the guards, a burly man with a shaved head, scoffed. "Save your breath, lady. The HOA is the law around here, and nobody's going to believe the word of a troublemaker like you." Amanda leaned forward, her gaze intense. "That's where you're wrong. I have evidence. Irrefutable proof of the HOA's illegal activities. And I've got the support of the entire community behind me." The guards exchanged uneasy glances, and Amanda knew she had struck a nerve. She pressed on, her tone confident and resolute. "You can't keep us locked up here forever. Sooner or later, the truth is going to come out, and when it does, the HOA is going to crumble." The lead guard, a woman with a severe expression, stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Well, let me tell you something. The HOA has ways of making people disappear, and we won't hesitate to use them if you continue to be a thorn in our side." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to be intimidated. "Go ahead and try," she said, her voice laced with defiance. "But I've got allies out there who won't rest until they've exposed the truth about the HOA." The guards exchanged another uneasy glance, and Amanda knew she had struck a nerve. She pressed on, her voice low and intense. "Look, I know you're just doing your job, but you have to realize that you're on the wrong side of this battle. The HOA is exploiting all of us, the residents, the community, even you. Don't you want to be on the right side of history?" The guards fell silent, and Amanda could see the conflict playing out on their faces. She knew she had to keep pushing, to appeal to their sense of conscience and morality. "Think about it," she said, her voice softer now. "If the truth comes out, the HOA is going to fall, and you'll be left holding the bag. Isn't it better to be on the winning side, the side that's fighting for justice and the well-being of the community?" The lead guard opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the sound of commotion outside drew their attention. The guards exchanged a worried glance and hurried out of the room, leaving Amanda alone. As she sat there, her mind raced with possibilities. Had her words struck a chord with them? Were they considering turning against the HOA? Or was this just another ploy to lull her into a false sense of security? Amanda didn't have long to ponder these questions, as the door burst open once again, and a familiar face appeared. Richard Thompson, the community leader. "Amanda," he exclaimed, his expression a mix of relief and urgency. "We need to get you out of here now." Amanda felt a surge of hope, but also a twinge of concern. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice low. Richard's expression hardened. "The HOA's got the police in their pocket. They're trying to frame us for a whole host of crimes, and they're not going to stop until we're all behind bars." Amanda felt her stomach twist with dread, but she refused to let it show. "Then we need to act fast. What's the plan?" Richard gave her a grim smile. "We're going to take the fight to the HOA, Amanda. This is our chance to expose their corruption once and for all." As Amanda followed Richard out of the holding cell, she knew that the stakes had never been higher. The future of the entire community hung in the balance, and she was determined to come out on top, no matter the cost. The streets were eerily silent as Amanda and the community leaders made their way towards the Wilkins mansion, the air thick with tension and foreboding. Richard had explained the situation on the way. The HOA had launched a relentless smear campaign, using their connections within the local police force to turn the residents against them. "They're trying to paint us as the villains," Richard had said, his voice laced with frustration. "But we're not going to let them get away with it." As they approached the imposing gates, Amanda could see the telltale signs of the HOA's security presence. Armed guards patrolling the perimeter, surveillance cameras mounted at strategic locations. It was clear that they were prepared for a fight. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Amanda asked, her stomach churning with a mixture of trepidation and determination. Richard gave her a reassuring nod. "Trust me, Amanda. We've been planning this for weeks. The HOA won't know what hit them." With a deep breath, Amanda stepped forward and pressed the intercom button, her voice clear and unwavering. "This is Amanda Sinclair. I'm here to speak with Mrs. Wilkins and the HOA board. It's time to end this once and for all." There was a brief pause, and then the gates creaked open, allowing them to pass through. As they approached the mansion, Amanda could feel the weight of the community's hopes and dreams resting on her shoulders. The front door swung open, and Mrs. Wilkins emerged, her expression a mix of triumphant smugness and barely concealed unease. Well, if it isn't the little troublemaker and her merry band of do-gooders," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I must say, I'm impressed that you managed to break out of our little holding facility." Amanda stepped forward, her chin held high. "Cut the act, Mrs. Wilkins. We know the truth about your corrupt organization, and we're here to put an end to it." Mrs. Wilkins' lips curled into a cruel smile. "Oh, I don't think so, my dear. You see, the residents of this community have already turned against you. They know that the HOA is the only thing standing between them and the chaos that would ensue without our guidance." Amanda felt a pang of doubt, but she refused to let it show. "That's not true, and you know it. The residents are waking up to your lies and deception, and they're ready to take back their neighborhood." Mrs. Wilkins chuckled, her expression one of amused condescension. "We'll see about that." She turned and gestured to the armed guards who had emerged from the shadows. "Take them away." As the guards moved in, Amanda felt a surge of panic, but Richard stepped forward, his expression calm and resolute. "Not so fast, Mrs. Wilkins. "We're not going anywhere." He pulled a small device from his pocket and pressed a button, and suddenly the air was filled with the sound of sirens. Amanda's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. The community leaders had set up a live stream, broadcasting the confrontation to the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Wilkins' face contorted with fury, and she turned to the guards, her voice trembling with rage. "What are you waiting for? Arrest them." But the guards hesitated, their expressions uncertain. They glanced around nervously, clearly caught off guard by the sudden attention. "The residents are watching, Mrs. Wilkins," Richard said, his voice steady and unwavering. "They know the truth now, and they're not going to let you get away with your crimes." Amanda felt a surge of triumph as she watched the HOA's carefully constructed facade crumble before her eyes. Mrs. Wilkins, realizing that her power was slipping away, let out a guttural scream of rage and lunged towards Amanda, her hands clawing at her throat. But before she could reach her, a group of uniformed officers burst through the gates, their weapons drawn. Mrs. Wilkins froze, her eyes wide with fear, as the officers surrounded her and the HOA board members, placing them under arrest. As the chaos unfolded, Amanda felt a sense of relief and vindication wash over her. The residents of the community had reclaimed their neighborhood, and the corrupt HOA had finally been brought to justice. It was a hard-fought victory, but one that would pave the way for a brighter future. A future where the residents would have a true say in the way their community was run, and where the principles of fairness and transparency would reign supreme. As the sun began to rise over the once embattled neighborhood, Amanda knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope and the promise of a better tomorrow.